From KCRW Santa Monica and KCRW.com, this is The Treatment.
Welcome to The Treatment. I'm Elvis Mitchell. I am honored to have with me the playwright, I like to think of him still as a journalist, and screenwriter Tom Stoppard, whose newest project is a co-production with HBO and the BBC of Ford Madox Ford's Parade's End. Tom, thanks so much for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
What was it about Parade's End that made you want to adapt it?
Well, I should say I hadn't read the book until they asked me if I were interested in doing this job.
Okay.
And Ford Madox Ford's always been something of minority pursuit. There's a book called The Good Soldier,
of course,
which most people who know of Ford, they know that book. But Parade's End turned out to be a book which relatively few people had read, but those who'd read it considered it a favorite novel. They were passionate about it. There was a bit of a cult around it. And I have
starting
to say,
with Graham Greene.
Indeed, he was early on the case, a great admirer. Ford was an earlier generation, and Parade's End is actually 4 novels, though I think of it as 3 and the coda. But they were written over the course of some years, at the birth of modernism, the year of The Wasteland, the year of Ulysses, for example, 1922. And it is an astonishing book. And I must say that although I didn't know quite what I was getting into, by the time I'd read 100 pages, I really wanted the job.
And I find it interesting because I think it's really the beginning of the 20th century. And I think of Christopher Hitchens, the protagonist, is kind of like the last of his breed. And there's a line in I Think a Man Should Stand Up that kind of describes him perfectly. A decent man should not act in panic. And that seems to me to crystallize his character.
Yes, you're absolutely right. The years stretch from 1912 to 1919, though in fact there's a prologue, as it were, when Christopher and Sylvia are getting married, maybe 1908. And Christopher Hitchens says of himself at a certain point, a later point significantly, he says of himself that when a man lives by an outmoded code of honor or code of behavior, people take him to be a fool. And, he says, I'm coming around to their opinion. So he is a protagonist who is living on the cusp of a sea change in private and public morality. I know this sounds too trite and glib for words, but the whole thing about the First World War changing everything, it cannot be wholly untrue. It was such a cataclysmic event, and a lot of things were different afterwards. The strong strand in the story of Parade's End is women and the vote. In fact, women finally got the vote, but only partially so. In 1918, women aged 30 who were married were allowed to vote. So, there are various journeys being made, and that particular one, the feminist journey, is being made by a young woman who's the third point of the love triangle, which is at the center of Parade's End.
I find it fascinating, too, because I find myself thinking of both Sylvia Hitchens and Miss Wannop as being almost Laurentian characters, and that, there's a line that describes your depiction of Sylvia kind of perfectly. Her joyful hatred at one point is alluded to, and that seems to be a kind of a driving force for you in her characterization, doesn't it?
There's a Laurentian overlap, isn't there? I mean, we're talking about people who are writing in the same climate, in the same heat, you could say, of those times. And as a matter of fact, Ford, the author of Parade's End, was also an editor of genius. He was the editor of 2 magazines at different points, one in Paris, one in England. The Parisian one was called Transatlantic Review, published very early Hemingway, for example. And he published the English Review later. And through the letterbox came a short story by D.H. Lawrence, and Ford apparently didn't even get to the end of reading it. He just said, "We'll publish this, do it." But there are also differences between Lawrence and Ford, because Lawrence was a bit of a pagan and had a tremendous rapport with nature, if you want to put it that way. Christopher and Sylvia Tietjens, I think, would find themselves slightly astonished if they were confronted by nature in the raw. They live in the upper class, leisured world of educated people who were the entitled class.
But there's a sense of awareness of the, as Lawrence might put it, the animal nature that Sylvia definitely has, and she's kind of rent by that. That's why that I was so struck by it, because I haven't had a chance to finish rereading Parade's End before I saw it. But I just remember that phrase, joyful hatred, and that's just so her. I mean, that's a section that...
It's a very good phrase to pick up on, certainly because it's so her, as you say. But that oxymoron is also so Ford. It's so Parade's End. One of the things which I think make the book substantial and significant to this day, gosh, what a pompous thing to say, but there we are. Too late to take it back. But one of the things which is just great about this book is that the internal contradictions are rife. It is not a cut-out character book, you go, this guy's good, this woman's bad, and so on, or, nothing is unshaded. And, you think, poor Christopher married to this bitch, and then you think, God, poor woman, who would want to be married to him with his certain degree of priggishness, I would say, in Christopher.
My memory of the book was it seemed to not be the kind of thing I would associate with you, just because Christopher as a character is so direct. There's no irony in him. There's no sarcasm in him. That kind of sort of incisive and precise wordplay that I think with you is completely stripped away of him. But as I heard the dialogue, so beautifully rendered by Benedict Cumberbatch, I could hear you saying it. It sounded like the kind of things you would say, because I find myself thinking a little bit of George in Jumpers, who's kind of that way, isn't he?
I haven't been interviewed by a man so well briefed for about 40 years. Listen, you got it. You just quoted something. It's from the book. This is something that Ford definitely wrote, where Christopher says something, he's had a letter from his wife, and he says something fairly savage to his friend he's having breakfast with. And the friend, furious and cold, says, "You have a way of putting things." And Christopher replies, "I haven't. If I had, it would have been better for me." That's quite a good summing up of a lot of this person, this character, this book, this TV show.
And I thought that might be, once you started to read, the fact that because nature and trying to understand nature and yet being slaves to it is, to me, so integral to the characters that you write. They're often quite eloquent about this. And in his way, despite having no detachment from who he is, he still has a painful sense of self-awareness, Christopher Tietjens does.
I think he does. We're in a scenario which was very old by the time Max Ford got to it, and it is on television every night also. We're in a scenario where a man is in love with two women, or a woman is in love with two men, or is in a transition between one man and another. In other words, the classic situation of a married man who meets somebody who he feels should have been the person he would spend his life with. And other things being equal, would have done. Now, nowadays, people come together and they flow apart, and it's not such a big deal, even for the children, after 6 months have gone by. It wasn't like that when we were young, or before we were born. So I think that where the tension in everything lies is that you're watching a person who is moving from a place where he has no options he says actually monogamy and chastity. That's what I believe in. Just tough luck if it leaves you alone. It's a man who is moving against what he would have thought to be immovable moral principle towards a position which is not only modernist as literature, it's modernist as morality. And it's this movement in society, embodied by Tietjens, on the one hand, which drives the book. But on the other hand, his wife is also a character who's been familiar in the imagination and in all kinds of literature for centuries. The maverick woman, the woman who does what she wants to do.
But she took on a different
surface.
Exactly.
In fact, she's rather maligned. She doesn't, as a matter of fact, deserve all of her reputation. But I think that what is kind of also something which ought not to be forgotten is that the third person, whose name is Valentine and is the young woman with whom Christopher falls in love, her journey I personally find particularly moving, because it is the journey which moves from idealistic aspiration and a kind of a virginal idealism, a belief in a kind of world of art and poetry,
and it's also
goodness.
It's the forward fixation that we see a bit in A Good Soldier as well, on sort of the promise of the juvenile and having innocence stripped away.
Yeah, and it's not so much stripped away as just beaten out of her by history. That war, which in certain ways was not as horrible as the war which followed 20 years later, and not as uncontained and so on. But that war somehow was a bridgehead for the society which came after it. And these three people, and other people in Ford's book, they're being tossed around in the wake of all this.
I have to tell you, I think the last episode so beautifully kind of reduces and conflates A Man Should Stand Up. I think it's extraordinary the extent to which, as you're saying, how much was you and how much was Ford.
I had to reach out for the newspaper history, for heaven's sake, because the novel doesn't provide the dramatic motor, the continuous action, and the dramatic pieces which would allow you to use all that good stuff that Ford is putting into his characters' brains, not very often into their mouths, because very often there's great stuff in there which you want to use, which is not being spoken out loud to anybody, and there's nobody there to speak to. So I was constantly putting stuff in which was authentic to history, but not to the novel. For example, in the period which the story covers, a woman walked into the National Gallery and slashed the Rokeby Venus, which is a famous Velázquez nude. So I was sort of using stuff in order to have the dramatic straw with which to make the bricks. You needed things which weren't in the book. Why have I started on this riff? It seems to be all about me.
That's why you're here, Tom, because
Okay.
this is all about you. But one of the things I do love that you did that's, I think, kind of a climax is coming out of the mist in the first episode into basically the 20th century. I mean, they're kind of lost in a Byronic mist, and they're run over almost by the 20th century. That's a pretty wonderful thing to have done. And
It's a famous set piece in the novel. We called it The Ride in the Mist. I think it's interesting in all sorts of ways, one of which is that it prefigures the fog of battle in the trenches where the story eventually ends up. But The Ride in the Mist is actually early on in the trilogy, or the quartet, whatever you like to call it. And it's modernity in the sense that a man and a woman are not supposed to be out all night together in a horse and trap, you know. It's a marvelous thing in the book because It's where she falls in love with him and he with her. And it's kind of all over when the mist clears and they go their separate ways until the story brings them together again a year later. You know, with these things, one hesitates to talk about how we made it, you know, how we made Gone with the Wind, whatever. But in fact, I was very inexperienced in production. I really don't know anything. And I said, how do you do a thing like that? And they said, well, there's no way you can cheat it. And we ended up in a hangar in Belgium, a hangar full of dry ice, smoke, mist. And I loved it because there was no technology involved later than 1912. I mean, the thing, you just get a big building and you fill it with fog and you get a horse and you get a cart and you put your actors in it and they learn the dialogue and the horse walks and they talk and that's it. You've done it. It took a day.
What works so well in this adaptation is but that process of condensation, there's illusion that creates real tension. And by moving that and not having them disappear from each other's lives the way they do in the book, it really creates a kind of tension that makes it a perfect complement to the book.
Yes, and it's something that you can do more effectively on television than you can in print, which is that you can come back to that moment and show it again. You can, as it were, pluck the past out for 3 beats and just bang it into the middle of the story 2 years later, because the story covers, 5 years. And we've been mentioning the trenches and that, and fair enough. I've talked a little bit about the fact that the First World War was an important event here. But actually, the first thing I really insisted upon with Parade's End was this is not a World War I story. There's been a lot of World War I stuff, and very good and so on, but this was not that as far as I was concerned. The war occupies pretty much all of the 4th episode and about half the 5th. But it's not, we had this quite modest location, and I think that Susanna White, the director, and her team, did amazing things in the time and the space that they were occupying then. As a matter of interest, we visited Steven Spielberg's location when he was making War Horse, because there were, friends of mine involved, and we went to say hello one day. And, I was kind of looking at Steven's World War I location like a child with his nose jammed up against a sweet shop window. But, it was right for his movie. What we had was right for ours. It was really good, I thought, how it worked out.
I think so, too. My guest, who's leaving steam on the sweet shop window, is Tom Stoppard. We're talking about his new project, the adaptation of Parade's End on HBO. You find a way to show how these physical actions really are kind of catalysts for people's lives changing. Each physical act has enormous repercussions here. I mean, and because of the condensation, they come much closer together and give this whole thing a kind of a vibrancy that I would not have associated with Ford.
I think the dramatizer, the adapter, has an advantage, actually, because in dealing with images, you can flash something in front of an audience's eyes and move on in 3 seconds. The book has, a prose writer has to establish things in a different way. I think once you start at the top of page 1 of an adaptation, everything you've worked for up to that point, you have to sort of forget. In other words, I spent a long time reading and rereading the book and making my notes and breaking it down into its component parts until I had a pretty good understanding of everything in the book. But then, that you push that to one side and you write page 1 and you kind of know how you want to get in there. And the smart thing is not to know too much up front, just to sort of try to make the thing work organically. And then all the preparation you put into familiarizing yourself with the book pays off because you're working within those parameters all the time. If you start crossing the line outside what the book wants it to be, your head is telling you that because you've done the preparation. But other than that, one is thinking 60 minutes of TV time. I mean, this sounds really. It sounds awful, actually.
What?
But what I'm trying to say is that however great the book is and whatever you think about your own self, what you're trying to do is to make people want to keep watching it and come back to it a week later. In America, a day later. That's something I just found out. In America, it's being done on successive nights.
Did you not know that?
Well, we didn't do that in England. We had it separated by 7 days. I must say, that sounds like a good idea, actually. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. Anyway, the point is, you're working on this thing, which is, first of all, it's called a series here. What it actually is a serial. And a serial isn't quite the same thing as a series. A serial is something where at the end of each segment of an hour, the story is by no means over, and you're almost I love the idea of almost ending an episode almost in the middle of a sentence. I wish I could and finish it a week later.
Well, with the first episode, you kind of do. I mean, that's a real climax. Even I have to say, as somebody who knew the book, I was still kind of my breath was taken away by it. And what I wanted to say too is talking about Sylvia. I mean, that first of the casting, Rebecca Hall, is kind of wonderful, but also just making her a modern figure. I mean, really like almost anachronistic modern figure in the piece.
Yeah.
And I wondered when that came to you.
Well, I really was trying to follow, as it were, the bloodlines. I mean, I just felt I knew her by the time I'd finished reading. And I didn't think I'm going to have to do something to make her modern. To me, she just is modern. She is ahead of the game, I think. And the main thing about Sylvia is that it's the easiest thing in the world to play her an out-and-out bitch. And it would be a bad mistake. And because Rebecca has the subtlety and the intelligence to know how to handle that kind of characterization, as I said earlier, I believe, you keep changing sides in the war of the Tegians. That's got to be good news.
I think that is it. It helps, too, to have Benedict Cumberbatch, who has a voice that's 10 years older than he is. So it kind of imparts all kinds of things, doesn't it?
Ben, God, I watched a lot of Ben shooting because I went to the shoot for half the shooting days, which I never ever do. I visit a film I've written or something like once. Hello, everybody. With this, I felt so strange about it, proprietorial, and also I would say possessive. Might I say?
Had you never felt that way before in an adaptation?
No, I didn't. I never did. This one, I just put so much of myself into it. And it had occupied the time of my life when I might have written another play, but did this instead. I just thought of this as the next big proper job I'd done. So the result was I kept showing up at the location. The director, Susanna White, liked my being there, which was very nice. I used to watch Benedict and listen to him, and I was quite impressed by how within everything was, how he wasn't going to kind of flash the goods at you all the time, and occasionally think, is this actually going to register? And then you watch the dailies, and even better, the cut footage, and you begin to understand what Benedict is about and what he's up to and how good he is. And I must say I do think we were so fortunate to end up with Benedict and Rebecca, and we might not have done if we had, if everything had gone smoothly. We might have been shooting a year earlier with other people.
Oh my gosh, did that almost happen?
Yeah. I mean, Benedict was actually quite an early idea. He was on a very short list. And he was unavailable, and the delays were such that he became available again before we managed to get going. So yes.
Well, I keep going back to meet Laurentian because it feels, in watching the dramatization, more Laurentian than I'd thought. And except there's a directness, especially in the way that you rendered the dialogue for Christopher, that has the really kind of the directness almost of the Hemingway short stories. I mean, he can almost have stepped out of the Short Happy Life of Francis Macomber.
Well, you've hit on. When I was of a certain age, like probably 22, he was far and away my favorite writer.
Really?
Yeah, for about 10 years. And I still revere Hemingway now. I mean, I still think about Hemingway. Look, it's always a great temptation to, as it were, accommodate one's interviewer by seeing exactly what he's driving at. I'm still working rather hard at trying to get Lawrence and Christopher Tietjens into the same suit. Also, there is a kind of Puritan strain in Lawrence. You're obviously keen on Lawrence, you yourself, but there is a Puritan strain in Lawrence, which absolutely is in the Venn diagram of Christopher Tietjens' character. I can see that. And the other thing which is quite interesting is that Lawrence, who is the son of, he came from a miner's cottage in Nottinghamshire. When he was Tietjens' age, he was consorting with Tietjens' friends. I mean, in the strange overlap between fiction and fact, Ottilie Morrell and Bertrand Russell. I mean, that generation of people who were anything between 25 and 45. Lawrence knew them and moved among them for quite a period of his life before he went to America and Australia and so on. If Tietjens had been a real character, he could quite well have met D.H. Lawrence.
Well, Tom, I thank you for accommodating my questions, Tom. It's been a pleasure having you here. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Oh, thank you. My guest is Tom Stoppard, who adapted Ford Max Ford's Parade 10 for HBO. Our recording engineer is Melissa Morton, who mixes the show. It's edited and produced by Jenny Radelet. I'm still being accommodated. I'm Elvis Mitchell. It's The Treatment.
Find past episodes of The Treatment at KCRW.com or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Listen to The Treatment on demand on your smartphone with KCRW's apps. The Treatment is produced and distributed by KCRW Santa Monica.